Hello everyone! In our last unit, we learned a lot about ancient Greece and the ancient Greek civilization. We talked about a lot of components or parts of civilization and what those components looked like in ancient Greece. In this domain, we're going to talk a little bit more about one of those components. We're going to talk about the component religion. Remember, the ancient Greeks believed in many different gods and goddesses. Let's see them here in our picture. They believed that these gods and goddesses lived in the tallest mountain in ancient Greece, Mount Olympus. We're going to read some stories that the Greeks believed were true about these gods and goddesses. But these are not true stories. These are fictional stories. If something is fictional, does that mean that it's describing something that really happened? No, a fictional story is an untrue story, or one that is made up. The fairy tales and tall tales that we read in our first domain were fictional stories. We know because things happened in those stories that wouldn't actually happen in real life or couldn't happen in real life. The stories we read in our last domain were true stories though, or non-fictional stories. They were about things that actually took place. In this domain, we will be reading a special type of fictional story called myths. A myth is a fictional story that features supernatural characters. These supernatural characters usually have some kind of special powers. Remember, the ancient Greeks, believed that their gods and goddesses controlled different aspects in nature or had special powers. These are supernatural beings. Another feature that many supernatural beings have is that they are immortal. The Greeks also believed that their gods and goddesses were immortal. If something is immortal, that means that it will live forever and never die. Again, the Greeks believed that their gods and goddesses were immortal, so they would always be there and always live. But humans are not immortal. Humans will live and eventually die. Humans are called mortals because we do not live forever. These myths that we'll read will often explain different things in nature, and the gods and goddesses our gods and goddesses will be featured in a lot of these myths. Some of these myths will have other supernatural characters as well. Myths, like folktales and fairy tales, are spread by word of mouth or spread orally, where they're told over and over again until someone eventually writes them down. We're going to hear a lot of well-known Greek myths that originated in ancient Greece. Many of these myths will feature really interesting magical characters, many of whom are the gods and goddesses that were worshipped by those who lived in ancient Greece. Take a minute to think about some of the gods and goddesses that we learned about. We talked about them a little bit in our last domain. What do you remember about these 12 gods and goddesses? 11 in this picture. We're missing Dionysus, I believe. What do you remember about these gods and goddesses? Do you think you could name every single one of them and tell me what was special about each one? Maybe not, but today we'll talk about these gods and goddesses again, and we'll review who they were and what special things they were in charge of. Before we read our first story today, we're going to go over some of the vocabulary words that we'll see. All right, my friends, I've got a couple of questions about the story we just read. My first question is about the setting. Remember, a setting tells us when and where a story took place. What was the setting of our story today? You've got it. Our setting was ancient Greece in the city-state Olympia. Olympia was where the Olympics were held. The Olympics were originally a religious festival to honor the king of all of the gods and goddesses. Do you remember who that is? You're right, the god Zeus. On the way to Olympia, Leonidas was learning about a couple of the gods and goddesses, some of the gods and goddesses. His father Cyrus was telling him about them. Turn to your neighbor or whoever is helping you today and tell them about some of those gods and goddesses that Leonidas learned about in our story. Who were some of the gods and goddesses that he learned about, and what was special about them? All right. Why were Leonidas and Cyrus headed to Olympia? What were they doing there? They were there to be spectators at the Olympic Games or to watch them. And they were also there to sell their wares. Wares are goods that someone made to sell. So they were selling pottery. Did Leonidas think that all of those gods and goddesses that he learned about were real? Yes, like many people that lived in ancient Greece, he believed the gods and goddesses were real characters. At the end of the story, Leonidas got a glimpse of something on Mount Olympus. What did he get a glimpse of? You're right. He thought he got a glimpse of the palace where the gods and goddesses live. All right, I want you to turn to whoever is helping you today again. And I want you to tell them, how are the gods and goddesses that Leonidas learned about in our story and humans similar? How are they similar and how are they different? We're going to compare and contrast the gods and goddesses with humans. How are they similar and how are they different? All right, my friends, we're going to go over some of those gods and goddesses. I'm going to pull up some pictures of them or paintings of them. Tending. Tending means taking care of or caring for someone or something. On Saturday mornings, Javier could always be found outside tending his garden. Securely. Securely means tightly or firmly. Caio and her mother attached their bikes securely to the back of the car. Glimpse. A glimpse is a brief or quick look. Jan snuck into the kitchen before the party to get a glimpse of her birthday cake. Sanctuary. A sanctuary is a holy place. The voices of the choir filled the sanctuary where people were worshiping. Spectators. Spectators are observers or people who watch an event. The spectators waited in their seats for the basketball game to begin. Again, spectators are people who watch events. People who participate in an event are called participants. I'm going to read a couple of different sentences. If the group described is a group of spectators or people who are watching, I want you to say they are spectators. If the group described is a group of participants or people who are participating in an event, say they are participants. All right, our first one, a family sitting in the bleachers at a track meet. They are spectators. What about boys and girls competing in an ice skating competition? They are participants. What about people observing a rocket launch? They would be spectators. And our last one, students singing in a chorus concert. They would be participants. Leonidas woke up early on the day of the foot races. Still lying in bed, he could hear his father Cyrus outside tending the horses. He's probably feeding them, Leonidas thought to himself. and then we'll harness them to the cart and make our way to Olympia. Olympia was the site of the day's foot races in honor of Zeus, the leader of all the Greek gods and goddesses. Leonidas and his father would take their pottery to sell to the people at the races, and when they had sold all they could, they would watch the races. Pottery is a name for vases, pots, bowls, or plates shaped from moist clay and hardened by heat. Many groups of people have made pottery since ancient times. Leonidas knew that if he asked, his father would tell him again how the gods and goddesses came to be, and why he and other Greeks honored them with races, festivals, and feasts. It was his favorite story, and he loved to hear his father tell it. But first, Leonidas had to get out of bed and dressed. Otherwise, he wouldn't get to hear that story or see the races at all. After breakfast, he went outside to help his father, Cyrus, who had just finished harnessing the first of their 2 horses to the cart. "Good morning, Father," Leonidas said. "Good morning, son. We're almost ready to go. Will you help me harness this last horse?" Leonidas nodded, and together, as the sun burnt away the morning fog, father and son harnessed the second horse. Once they double-checked that the horses were securely fastened to the cart, Leonidas and Cyrus finished storing their pottery safely in the cart. Then, taking their seats on a wooden plank or thick board at the front of the cart, they started their journey to Olympia. After they'd traveled some miles down the road, Leonidas asked, "Father, will you tell me again the story of the gods and goddesses?" "Are the gods and goddesses real or fictional?" "Right, they're fictional." "Does Leonidas, the boy in our story, believe that the gods and goddesses are real, or does he also think that they're fictional?" "He believes they are real. The boy in the story believes these gods are real." "Of course, son," his father answered. "As you know, we're going to Olympia for the foot races held in honor of Zeus. Olympia is the home of an important sanctuary devoted to Zeus, where we celebrate him and the other Olympian gods and goddesses with sporting competitions. The 12 gods of Mount Olympus are the most powerful of all of the many gods, and Zeus is their leader. Of course, Mount Olympus is actually far away, but this is a beautiful valley, beloved to them and perfect for the games." Their cart went over a bump, and Cyrus turned around to check their wares briefly before continuing the story. Wares are goods. What kind of wares did Cyrus and Leonidas have in their cart? Right, they had pottery. These gods and goddesses can sometimes be just like you and me. They can feel happy or sad, jealous and angry, or generous and loving. Unlike you or me, they have special powers to control things like the seasons and the weather, and where there is war, and sometimes with whom we fall in love. And unlike you and me, the gods are immortal. That means that they never die. Cyrus paused before continuing on with Leonidas's favorite part of the story. That's how the gods are different from mortals on Earth. But do you know how to tell them apart from one another? Remind me, what does it mean to be mortal? Right, a mortal thing is a living thing that will eventually die. Humans are mortals. Leonidas did know, but he wanted his father to continue telling the story. So he said, "Yes, father, but tell me anyway." Cyrus continued on, saying, "Well, as I said before, Zeus is the leader of all the gods and protects us here on Earth. He has a voice like rolling thunder and controls the wind, rain, and lightning, which he also uses as his weapons. He has 2 brothers, Hades and Poseidon, and together they rule over the whole world. While Zeus controls the heavens, Poseidon controls the sea and rules over it with a trident. When he strikes the ground with his trident, the earth shakes, and when he strikes the seas with it, the waves rise up as tall as a mountain. Zeus and Poseidon are two of the 12 gods who live on Mount Olympus and have thrones there. Leonidas and his father came to a fork in the road and turned left. They could now see other carts ahead of them in the distance, other vendors looking to sell their wares at the foot races in Olympia. And what about Hades, Zeus's other brother? Leonidas asked. While Zeus rules the heavens and Poseidon rules the sea, Hades rules the underworld, or the land of the dead. Hades has a helmet that makes him invisible, so that no one, friend or foe, can see him coming. Hades' throne is in the underworld, where he lives, Cyrus said. He sounds scary. Leonidas shivered. Who else lives on Mount Olympus? Well, Cyrus said, Zeus also has a sister who has a throne on Mount Olympus. Demeter is the goddess of the harvest and grain. She looks after all of the fields and crops on Earth. Zeus's wife, Hera, also lives on Mount Olympus. She is the queen of the gods and goddesses, and is the goddess of women's lives. How many is that? Cyrus turned and asked his son. Counting on his fingers, Leonidas said, Zeus, Poseidon, Demeter, and Hera. Just 4. Who are the other gods and goddesses who live on Mount Olympus? Well, there's Hephaestus, god of fire and the blacksmith of the gods, Aphrodite, goddess of love, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Ares, god of war. Then there are the twins, Apollo, the god of light and music, and his sister Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. There's Hermes, the messenger of the gods, and finally Dionysus, the god of grapes and the youngest of all the gods. Even though these are the most powerful of all the gods and goddesses, Zeus is the strongest of all, and it is he whom we honor today. Cyrus stopped the cart. They had finally reached Olympia. Spectators and vendors moved all around them as the athletes stretched in preparation for their races. Remember, spectators are people there to watch the races. Leonidas knew that many miles away was the cloud-covered Mount Olympus. As the midday sun shone through some of the clouds, Leonidas imagined he could see the briefest glimpse of a palace with the 12 golden thrones. All right, my friends, I've got a couple of questions about the story we just read. My first question is about the setting. Remember, a setting tells us when and where a story took place. What was the setting of our story today? You've got it. Our setting was ancient Greece in the city-state Olympia. Olympia was where the Olympics were held. The Olympics were originally a religious festival to honor the king of all of the gods and goddesses. Do you remember who that is? You're right, the god Zeus. On the way to Olympia, Leonidas was learning about a couple of the gods and goddesses, some of the gods and goddesses. His father Cyrus was telling him about them. Turn to your neighbor or whoever is helping you today and tell them about some of those gods and goddesses that Leonidas learned about in our story. Who were some of the gods and goddesses that he learned about, and what was special about them? All right. Why were Leonidas and Cyrus headed to Olympia? What were they doing there? They were there to be spectators at the Olympic Games or to watch them, and they were also there to sell their wares. Wares are goods that someone made to sell, so they were selling pottery. Did Leonidas think that all of those gods and goddesses that he learned about were real? Yes, like many people that lived in ancient Greece, he believed the gods and goddesses were real characters. At the end of the story, Leonidas got a glimpse of something on Mount Olympus. What did he get a glimpse of? You're right. He thought he got a glimpse of the palace where the gods and goddesses live. All right, I want you to turn to whoever is helping you today again, and I want you to tell them, how are the gods and goddesses that Leonidas learned about in our story and humans similar? How are they similar and how are they different? We're going to compare and contrast the gods and goddesses with humans. How are they similar and how are they different? All right, my friends, we're going to go over some of those gods and goddesses. I'm going to pull up some pictures of them, or paintings of them. We learned about Zeus, king of all gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus, and the god of thunder, lightning, wind, and rain. Zeus's wife Hera, goddess of women and women's lives. Zeus's brother Poseidon, god of the sea and all that cross the sea, and god of earthquakes. Zeus and Poseidon's brother Hades, the god of the underworld. Zeus's sister Demeter, goddess of plants and the harvest. Ares, the god of war. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. Hephaestus, the god of fire and the blacksmith for the gods. Hephaestus's wife, Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and love. Hermes, the messenger for the gods. Dionysus, the god of grapes and theater. Apollo, the god of light, music, and poetry. And Apollo's twin sister, Artemis, the huntress goddess of animals and wilderness. All right, go ahead and get the PDF that's attached to this assignment opened up. When you have it opened in Kami, it should look like this. We'll work on this first page. The second page is a letter to let you know what we'll be learning about in the next coming weeks. On this page, we're going to start working on a journal about all of the things and characters and people that we will be learning about in this domain. Today, we're going to focus on the character Zeus. So our title is going to be Zeus. Our journals are going to be very similar to the notes that we took in our last domain. They're going to help us remember important information about these characters and things that we think we want to remember about them. On today's journal entry, we're going to talk about why Zeus was so important to the ancient Greeks. We'll also probably want to mention what Zeus was known for and what his special powers were. You might also want to put in a sentence about his family and who his family members were and what his family was like. For today's assignment, I want you to write 2 or 3 sentences about Zeus. Remember, some things that you could include in your writing are what Zeus was known for, what his special powers were, why he was important to the people in ancient Greece, and about Zeus's family. When you have written 2 or 3 sentences, there is a second page if you need extra room. When you are finished with your sentences for today's journal entry, go ahead and turn it in.